This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April the 24th, the Institute hosted the fourth in its series of annual conferences on themes in defense and security studies. This year's conference focused on global challenges to Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic.
So I'd like to invite Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer to come forward and close out our conference today.
Thanks, Dan. And thank you to the organizers, by the way, for an excellent day. Pulling together this amount of brain power and I think a variety of different perspectives on things is always valuable. So for someone like me who attends lots and lots of Arctic conferences, to pull away as much as I have from today is a validation, again, of how rich this particular discussion has been. And I think my summative comments here, which I'll try to keep to no more than 25 minutes at most, are going to touch on a lot of things that we've already been playing with. Certainly thinking about some of our conversations as being on the front lines of climate change. You'll see a picture in a second of me on the sea ice in the Labrador Sea about 10 years ago, which was my first moment of realizing we are living climate change now. It's not some future-oriented problem that will emerge. It's very real, and go up to the north and you live this. In terms of the idea of a changing Arctic, well documented. It's there in Strong, Secure, Engage, Canada's new defense policy coming out, talking about the region as an important international crossroads. Whether that's referring to the Canadian Arctic in particular, whether it's talking about the circumpolar Arctic, brings up some of those definitional questions that Sheila and others have raised and which we'll re-engage with. How are we imagining the Arctic? How are we imagining Canada's place within it? Is it a constructive space where we see opportunities? Is it a place of challenge, of risk, of threat? Maybe it's a mix of all of these things, as we've heard today. So this reminds me of the importance and centrality of narratives. What stories are we telling about the Arctic? Not only looking back, but also looking forward. What are we imagining in terms of desired futures, but also undesirable outcomes? How are we imagining what this place could be? And to me, that's not a work of naivete. It's not contrived. The world is not simply governed by discourse and what we speak, but certainly the way we frame things and the way we seek to understand issues very much influences how we take stock of where we find ourselves today and where we might go going forward. So I find it refreshing that if it had been 10 years ago, it would have been Franklin Griffiths fighting the good fight against Rob Hubert, with Rob Hubert peddling you with a sovereignty is on thinning ice, the Northwest Passage is melting away, our sovereignty is going to be gone, we need to act now. And Andrew would have been at the back of the room going crazy, and Franklin would have come up and gave his measured, calm down, Rob, I used to think like you in the 1980s, but we've got beyond it here. There's still murmurs of this playing out in some of the media reports and frames that are out there. I think it's refreshing that in most of the academic discussions, this has largely been cast to the background. It's more of a way of looking at how the Arctic is tied, as both Adam and Andrea said, to global pressures, and that there may be spillover effects, which we'll get back to. But also that the Arctic is an incredible space because it blends and forces us to grapple with domestic and continental and international frames, involving a lot of the big actors around the world that are preoccupying Canadians and our allies. But then trying to actually parse which areas of those relationships are particularly Arctic concerns often gets lost in the message. And then also making sure that that last point, which was so eloquently presented to us by Krista, Indigenous and Northerners more broadly, being a priority, where do their voices, where do their priorities fit in? So to get us into the mindset of how we often conceive of the space, right, it's climate change maps, it's contested boundaries, it's Russians planting little flags a little over a decade ago, right? It's talk about undiscovered resources, meaning uncertainty in a region. And it's that uncertainty that I think feeds a lot of our insecurities. It's that we don't know that much. We don't understand all these interacting dynamics, which creates a sense of alarm. We're often afraid of things that we can't fully grasp in our hubris as human beings, thinking that we can never fully grasp anything. But this is how I think conventionally Canadians have seen it, right? Arctic is associated with the world as a bunch of hungry Pac-Mans wanting to nibble at our boundaries and steal this away. Goes back to the Alaska boundary dispute of the late 1890s and early 1900s. The notion that the Americans are trying to grab part of our territory from us, and even Mother England won't defend us, right? The catalyst for us setting up our Department of External Affairs way back in the day. And this was something that Prime Minister Harper certainly pounced upon when he took office. Framing a northern strategy in 2005, 2006 that was really equated with sovereignty, which was equated with what a few of us were saying were really security issues, which immediately became tied to defense. And a whole series of initiatives that I think most of us today have said were well warranted and are essential for a self-respecting sovereign nation that needs to defend Canada. Canada first, as Andrea reminded us, right? But we're packaged within this narrative of fear as if there was a world coming in to usurp our sovereignty away from us. So late 2000s, right, strong muscular images, not of the entire Canadian Armed Forces, significant percentage of, right? But going up and doing these activities, the $1 million shot, as it was called in Ottawa circles, to go and stage this, to show resolve. And I'm not belittling it. It showed a certain form of resolve. And it fit with traditional views of Arctic security, very much fixated on military defense, protecting borders, asserting state sovereignty over lands and waters, territorial integrity, right? And very much Cold War narratives as well, which are equating national security writ large to national defense and these deterrence issues that play out. So going back a decade ago, once again, we had the extremes. We had the Rob Huberts on the one hand saying, we're not doing enough, we need to be very toothy, we need to be digging in more, because a perfect storm is coalescing in the Arctic that threatens us. There's an arms race. And those AOPs, as we heard again today, are not combat capable. Here are the Norwegians and the Danes building ships that can actually apply kinetic effects against an adversary, and we're building a pea shooter, right? And the F-35s, and he says, yes, buy the expensive version. Then we got Michael Byers. We don't really know sometimes where he stood on the issues, but he was kind of a dove a lot of the time. But then in the next breath, he said, yes, NRA ops are not anything more than slush breakers, implying that they needed to be stronger and apply kinetic effects. The F-35 was a weak platform, could trigger an Arctic arms race, but then largely criticizing after 2009 this very narrative that Rob Hubert, and as Franklin Griffiths so memorably phrased, other purveyors of polar peril, right, were peddling at that time. Unpacking the debate as it existed was, to me, a lack of definitional clarity, a lack of precision about when people were talking about sovereignty. How is that different from security? People would talk about all these non-traditional security pressures that were emerging, but then lump them in as if they required a defense response to them. And what does control mean if it's brought into some sort of dialogue with sovereignty? Does the inability to control the space undermine our internationally recognized rights to control activities within a given jurisdiction, or however a lawyer might define sovereignty? So in essence, there was this equation of military investments were equating to militarization, and that this somehow portended or anticipated a military conflict that was bound to occur in the region. But then the Harper government does something in 2010 that we heard referenced. It comes out in 2009 with, in my mind, an eminently responsible, typically Canadian Northern strategy that says all the same words that Northern strategies had said back in the days of Trudeau the Elder, right? Modernized it, and then unveiled in 2010 a vision for the Arctic within an international context, talking about clearly defined boundaries, dynamic economic growth and trade, vibrant northern communities, healthy productive ecosystems. Same sort of stuff we heard today is going to be coming out in our Arctic and Northern policy framework, because it's a good framework, right? It's very Canadian. And emphasizing, under the Harper government, that there were no military challenges anticipated and that the region was well maintained within existing institutions. Again, this is not a partisan liberal versus conservative way of thinking. What I'm giving you here is this is the Canadian way consistently applied. And it's fascinating if we want to be academics and break down how, I did this way of looking at how was the noun sovereignty actioned under the Harper government in its speeches. What did it use to go and give it power? Early on, it was a focus on defending sovereignty and asserting sovereignty, strong muscular things. As time went on, it's the language of exercising sovereignty. And other language that, again, is much softer. So still, also, when you assert something, you have it, right? You have something to back you. A slow sort of confidence as well. And we don't have to look just to today to see a dismantling of a lot of the myths that were prevalent a decade ago, as early as 2011. The military not taking a political opening to go and conjure up ideas of military threats that would justify a surge of investments in military capabilities, a military behaving very responsibly and actually keeping off the pressure of the political level, high politics, dragging it into a space it didn't belong. Hold on. saying there's no direct threat to Canada's security in the north. Climate change is wreaking havoc everywhere. It's forcing us to test our fundamental assumptions. But DND is not the lead department. The military will play an essential role, but it will be a supporting role within a broader government response and community-based response to these initiatives. So what we saw going on was an embracing of broadened definitions of security, broadening out the space, not so it became meaningless, but suggesting that a lot of the dynamics, a lot of the most acute threats emerging in the Arctic weren't simply national defense and classic state security. There were new drivers that needed to be approached within that whole of government framework that was talked about before. Whole of government not only being amongst members of the federal family, but going down to the territorial and provincial levels, reaching down to Indigenous governments, other rights holders, stakeholders throughout the north. So what do these security challenges look like? The Arctic Integrating Concept back in 2010 said they look the same as they do in the rest of Canada. Why do we continuously have to treat the Arctic as if it's this inherently fundamentally different space when it's an integral, essential part of our country? And I think Commander Bealby referenced that this morning, which is important. So what we've seen exercised in the last decade in operations like Operation Nanook are a lot of practices of dealing with emergency response in the north, dealing with a lot of the most likely probable challenges. And in parts of the Yukon, this has included things like forest fighting, Matt, and other things, right? Testing out what community-based oil spill response could look like with kits. It's not going to be able to deal with a massive Manhattan-type oil tanker breaking up on a shoal in the north, but for small, containable, quick responses, you can turn to community capabilities. So again, on the spectrum of operations, for those of you who like to visualize it like this, there's always going to be a persistent need for Canada as a self-respecting nation to be able to invest in deterrence, in continental defense, to be credible with our allies, absolutely. But if we're looking at the day-to-day bread and butter things that the military and other government agencies are called upon to do, it's on the safety security side of the spectrum. A lot of things that we've been talking about today in great detail. So then the question I was asking of others, I guess I have to grapple with myself. Have we seen more change or continuity under the Trudeau government? I don't see major changes to Canada's northern strategy, which is why I'm very much reassured by this language of a validation. Yes, processes have been different. The consultations have been different, and that is important. There's certainly been a renewed emphasis on diplomacy and cooperation, certainly a much stronger focus on Indigenous rights and nation-to-nation relationships, a return of the language of the mitigation of climate change, not just adaptation, leaning forward and recognizing as a responsible international actor we need to play our part in helping to diminish its long-term effects, and then a strong ongoing commitment to Arctic defense. So in terms of Indigenous rights, this is something that should always be top of mind if you're trying to give a message to the Trudeau government that's going to have any traction. This is very near and dear to his heart, and the reconciliation agenda is front and center. It's also pervaded some of the messaging that we have seen come out, quite limited compared to the Harper years, in official statements on the Arctic agenda, coming in the form of bilateral statements with President Obama back in 2016, focusing on Arctic biodiversity, Indigenous science, building a sustainable Arctic economy, supporting strong Arctic communities, all sub-themes that we've probed today as well. But one where security and defense was conspicuously absent. Just wasn't the main focus of where we were going to play that leadership role within this space. Then we see Strong, Secure, Engage come out, and I was thrilled. A document that reflected a series of national consultations, including a roundtable up in Yellowknife, another one in Winnipeg with Indigenous stakeholders, that yielded a series of commitments that very much reinforced what the Harper government had put in place, building on what the Martin government had planned, by the way, back in 2004, just never got to actually implement because it didn't get voted in the following year. Right, but laying out an agenda that in my mind is modest, not only in carrying forward what the preceding government had done, but taking it its next logical steps into the future. So in terms of capabilities, we often talk about deficits, what Canada doesn't have compared to others. Adam raised an important point about, let's be careful about who we're comparing to and what sort of threat environment we face, and whether or not what we're investing in is not being done prematurely or irresponsibly, but is done in a credible way, and that we're also acknowledging what we have invested in. And when we look at what has been enhanced in terms of capabilities over the last decade, and what's in the process right now being produced, I think it will put us on a much stronger platform according to domestic, continental, and international, than we certainly were a decade and a half ago. And that reminder, Dan, here's for you, your reference to Afghanistan, right? A reminder from former Chief of the Defence Staff, Walt Latinchuk, harder for Canada to sustain operations in the high Arctic than for Canadian forces to sustain operations in Afghanistan, because in the Arctic, it's what you bring. Recognizing that there are parts of the Arctic mission set that are going to require unique capabilities. And we maybe touched on some of these, the importance of operational and tactical movement. We figured out over the last decade how to get Southern forces up into the Arctic, but what do they do once they get there? And we heard stories of frostbite during the NOREX, the Northern Exercise, this year, as happens every year, right? Do we have the right imagination of figuring out what tools and equipment we would be providing people? Persistent theme that came up in questions again last, communications. Very difficult in high latitudes, and a lot of uncertainty, but absolutely essential. Also other forms of communication, those cross-cultural communications that are absolutely essential if you're going to have meaningful relationships with Northerners at a community level. And a real internalization of the idea that the Arctic is a northern homeland. Indigenous communities, the heart of Canada's north, will work to expand and deepen our extensive relationships through the Rangers and Junior Rangers, but also local populations more broadly, right? Coming out in a defense policy statement flagging this as a strategic priority. So what are some of the recent trends that we've talked about? The most superficial one is, do we anticipate an Arctic that will be based in cooperation or conflict? Most scholars sort of say, yeah, it's mostly cooperative. There are some disconcerting trends that say competition's also there. But where are we going? Right? There's that Trump factor. China's interested in the Arctic. The United States elected Donald Trump. What does that mean in terms of relationships with Russia and so on? And what does all of this mean for Canadian security? Right? Like I said, we've moved largely beyond the sovereignty on thinning ice argument. But what does a spillover into the Arctic look like? And how then does defense policy reconceptualize the way we think about Arctic security? Read newspapers, it's Russia all the time. Go to NORAD in Colorado Springs, I'm sure it's Russia all the time. Go to Canadian Joint Operations Command, it probably depends on which cubicle you're in, whether it's Russia all the time or looking at other things. But a lot of narratives that are out there. I have a book coming out later this week that's open access, available online if you're looking at a diversity of voices, including Andrea's chapter, probably the strongest in the volume, looking at Canada, Russia, and Arctic security and what this all means. And again, there's lots to debate and discuss about what futures can hold. On the one hand, has the game changed? Did Russian aggression in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, at the same time as Syria was going on, and they were demonstrating their capabilities with hyperkinetic cruise missiles, a very expensive way to go and launch conventional ordnance onto a target, right? All this other stuff, matched with increasing bomber patrols and new bases and new Arctic units that Putin, his propaganda machine, loves to pump out, right? Does this mean that something's changing? Are they posturing for something? Is this preemptive sort of approach? And then flipping it around and saying, but from the Russian side, why does this have traction? The Russians have a siege mentality. They bought into the notion that the West reneged on all those promises that were made when the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War ended. We're the ones who pushed NATO up to their borders. We're the ones who are being provocative. And Putin can appeal to the Russian soul, which connects to the Arctic in a much more direct way. We heard, 10% of Russian GDP or 20% of Russian GDP being generated north of the Arctic Circle. This is something that Russians can really fear to lose because it will affect them materially. And it's something that can be played into. And it means that they can also turn around and, as we heard, right, pitch Canada as if we're a bristling military adversary laying just across the pole with 5,000 Canadian Rangers in their red hoodies and new rifles charging across to take over the Yamal Peninsula. No. But you get some of that stuff in some of the most extreme Russian media. Alternate narrative. Yes, there's a resurgent great power rivalry, but these are not generated by Arctic resource boundary dispute or governance issues. So we need to debate, sure, but we need to distinguish what are grand strategic level concerns that we have. How NATO is deterring Russia. What messages we're sending that are actually securing our big strategic interests. How are we going to manage China? How are we going to deal with economic security related to Canadian resources more broadly and energy security? And then the Arctic level ones. And what I'm going to suggest to you, most of those are community safety issues of the type that Colonel Richardson presented to us. There are issues about climate change adaptation and permafrost degradation and what that means for infrastructure and safe shipping and whether there can be sustainable Arctic resource development, as one of you pitched as a question. How do we differentiate between the North American and Eurasian Arctics, which are actually quite different spaces when we look at temperature and environmental conditions and possibilities? So yes, we're going to have competition. Sure, that will go on. This doesn't inherently mean there's going to be conflict, open war, and it doesn't preclude any cooperation on Arctic issues as I see it. And we've seen this space being opened up. It's not been at the forefront in the last couple of years since we had a change in our Minister of Global Affairs for understandable reasons, right? Chrystia Freeland has a different sort of take on a lot of these issues, understandably so. But certainly messaging, suggesting NATO's policy is deterrence and dialogue, Canada's will be. On areas where we have common ground with the Russians, why wouldn't we have conversations with them and explore opportunities? As long as we can do it in a way that doesn't validate their aggression in other parts of the world, is that a responsible act? What might this look like? It was touched on by Allison, but here would be my list, right? And I would suggest we're always encouraging looking forward. We can look back to past practices that we had with the Russians and even the Soviet Union in the height of the Cold War, scientific cooperation and research, shared interests in marine transport and safety, and you can go through the rest of the list here. And the Russians and the Canadians, being the two largest landholders, if you will, in the circumpolar world, have a shared interest in ensuring that Arctic coastal state sovereignty and sovereign rights are respected internationally. So we can be at odds with the Russians on a lot of things, but let's not assume that carries over inherently to the Arctic. So in terms of our international security priorities, this emphasis on dialogue and deterrence, and we need to recognize there are some limitations to multilateral defense and security cooperation. Right, we heard about the Arctic Council not having a mandate to deal with hard security issues. I see no clear benefits in the Arctic Council assuming one, despite people like Michael Byers and Rob Hubert having pushed for that for years. The heads of defense no longer get together and chat since 2014. I doubt that they will, because the defense cooperation is a precarious place to be if you're trying to oppose what the Russians have done in Ukraine. And NATO's Arctic role, remains a questionable one, and we've sort of touched on this already. My message for the Arctic Council, if it ain't broken, don't break it. It's doing a lot of great scientific work. By keeping it at the level of low politics and scientific cooperation, it can continue to be the steady drummer, even in times where the rest of the world is getting more complicated. In terms of NATO, we've seen it opening up. We've seen a government that has sort of broken with its predecessors over the last decade and a half and said, perhaps NATO might explore playing a more active role or a more explicit role in Arctic defense. It's done largely within a North Atlantic set of language, and Andrea's map that she showed us earlier helps to put that in some sort of perspective. I say if the Arctic does become a more explicit NATO priority, we need to distinguish between military threats to the North American, North Atlantic, or Nordic security regions that pass through, right? Andrea stated this much more eloquently than I will, that pass through regions of the Arctic, and keep that separate from what we see as risks or threats arising from Arctic disputes, which are highly unlikely. And then think about what the second and third order effects are of projecting force and sending certain strategic messages out there. We haven't talked a ton about China today, but I find it an interesting space. I had a book come out with some colleagues last year on it that I think almost took maybe too soft of a take on it. But in terms of China's Arctic policy, right, when we read it, it comes off as being very much aligned with the messaging from all of the Arctic states, right? Very much a player who's going to do exactly what we're asking for any Arctic observer state, according to the Kiruna Declaration, the regulations for observer status within the Arctic Council, protecting the environment, respecting the traditions of indigenous peoples, commitments to the existing framework of international law, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and so on. But then we see these maps of Arctic Polar Silk Road initiatives. Is this China's long con? Right? Are they able, as an authoritarian regime, where state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks are in cahoots with Beijing and controlled by the Communist Party, right? Where they can go and set up a long-term game, get their tentacles into the Canadian Arctic, become a political influencer over time, right? That this is a big confidence racket, if you believe Roger Robinson of the McDonald-Laurier Institute, a few years ago. That the Arctic is another Africa for China, right? Looking out 50 years and thinking about them marking themselves for undue or unwelcomed influence. But then we've got other voices. Maybe we should welcome East Asia with its capital. Right, these projects are high risk, long-term yield if ever yielding, real economic returns. We have dreams that in devolution it would mean that the territories would be prosperous and able to be self-sufficient. Show me the numbers, because it's never come close, and there's been devolution in the Yukon for quite a long time, and it's there in NWT. Reality is, if we want to go take these high-risk projects, you're typically not turning to Bay Street, right? You're going to people who are willing to tolerate that risk threshold, and that's going to be often Asian investors. Do we have to have faith that our systems more broadly are able to withstand those pressures? Is this really an Arctic question, or is this a Canadian question about what our tolerance is as a nation to preserve our resources and our way of life? Is China a revisionist actor that doesn't play by the same rules as the rest of us, that sees the Arctic as the common heritage of mankind, meaning it can't be owned by anybody? And we draw analogies. Way too much detail here, but it was mentioned this morning. Somebody saying, well, it's like the South China Sea. I would argue, no, it's not at all like the South China Sea. Canada doesn't want to say it's like the South China Sea. They're different issue sets, but that analogy is in Chinese minds, and why I think they have disincentives built in to challenging our legal position on the status of the waters of the Northwest Passage. Seeing it through the eyes of the other allows us to maybe diminish some of our fears, to say, I don't think it's in China's global interests to want to push this issue too far and to take a stance. Will they respect national jurisdiction? Their Arctic policy says that they will, but have they respected national jurisdiction when we were just complying, right, with a writ for the arrest of somebody that the Americans asked for in compliance with international law, doing what we have to do as a responsible international citizen as a country, and what punitive action has come around and has even been sugar-coated, right? So again, lots of big questions that are here. Future considerations also relate, will China be a responsible player in terms of international governance as it exists? And this is not a unique question facing Canada. All of the other Arctic states are thinking about it as well. Will they long-term be content to accept these institutions that we've invested a lot of energy, as we said, into going and building? And will it respect sovereignty, sovereign rights? On the other hand, we hear a lot about jobs. We talk about lagging economic indicators in the North. Yes, of course, you can say the growth is much larger percentage-wise than anywhere else, because if you start from a really, really small number, any mine that's opening or increasing production will have a dramatic effect. Make no mistake, the actual level of activity is quite small. Lots of dreams, the maps like the one that Sheila showed, always mix in both real exploratory and production, sites, but also mixes in anticipated potential ones. If we separate that out, we say, where are we looking for the financing for these kind of projects? The other rogue one, the Trump factor. Can we assume that all the Trudeau-Obama agenda has any resonance in Washington anymore? We certainly don't hear Trump going around speaking about the importance of Indigenous peoples and cultural diversity, for example, as something we need to embrace. We even hear murmurs from the US Navy, if you read some of the more sensational commentators, that they're talking about freedom of navigation voyages this summer. I don't think it will actually come to pass. We talked about the fraternity and sorority of the uniform, Andrea. I think that will hopefully quash this issue before it actually goes forward. This would be unduly and unnecessarily provocative. So the emerging narrative as I see it, resurgent great power rivalry may have spillover effects not generated by Arctic resource boundary dispute governance issues. We need to carefully distinguish, as I said, between those categories. And this to me fits very well with what Krista did. I thought Wayne Walsh was going to be here, so I stole his slide thinking that he'd show the same one. But what we see emerging as this Arctic and Northern policy framework, in my mind, is this affirmation or validation of a long-standing Canadian Northern strategy. That some of the language has changed, but that the essential elements are very much in place. And I took away today the comment as well that the defense, security, safety part spoke within this wheel wasn't there until consultations were had with Northerners who insisted that even though there'd been this unstated rule I heard within Trudeau's inner circle to not want to put sovereignty as a main guiding word because it would be too associated with the Harper government, that in fact it was Northerners during the consultations who insisted that this needed to be there and that defense was important. And generally defense is not seen as a dirty word in Northern communities because of those women and men in the red hoodies and the ranger instructors and other Canadian Ranger Patrol Group personnel who go up and have these trust relationships. So I might take us back to 2000 and say, we have had foreign policy statements on the Arctic before, and it gives us the guidance for what we're looking ahead to, because the language is not going to change irrevocably. So our Arctic security perspective, no immediate military threat. Of course, we need surveillance, national defense, strategic deterrence, work with neighbors to ensure it remains a zone of peace and stability. Yes, more traffic, more activity, more foreign presence means there are safety and security concerns commensurate with that increase in activity, and we need to be prepared for all of those contingencies. So what does this mean? Modernizing NORAD, all things we've talked about. Participating in multinational exercises, not just tactical, but as Andrea reminded us, strategic exercises as well. Joint intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance solutions, some of which are going to have to be specially tailored to the Arctic environment. The systems of systems approach that Commander Bealby referenced, and the need for all domain awareness and connecting it all together. Being more aware of those dark targets, who's entering into our Arctic, what they're doing here, right? All themes we've covered off. Ensure that foreign interests don't negatively influence the ability of Northerners and Canadians more broadly from pursuing a long-term strategy consistent with our values and interests. The other pieces, improving federal, territorial, provincial search and rescue, emergency management governance, better horizontal cooperation, not sexy stuff for politicians to unveil because it's not new shiny stuff to show, but right, the sinews that connect government and allow for more effective responses, more timely responses. Clarifying the practical roles that the Rangers and other community-based organizations play in response efforts. Coordinating their training opportunities to increase their effectiveness. Deeper collaboration with Indigenous communities, obviously. Following up, integrating efforts under that Oceans Protection Plan with $1 billion backing it. Huge, foundational initiative by this government. And then coming up with an Indigenous engagement strategy to fulfill that direction, to expand relationship with Indigenous communities in the North, not just relying on the Rangers, but figuring out the other ways that investments in augmenting defense capabilities will also have an enduring, persistent, positive presence on Northern communities. And then the Coast Guard, which has been raised, but we could have an entire workshop on itself. How do we go and enhance its capacity to support our safety, security, environmental, and economic interests? Through things like the Coast Guard Auxiliary, Gary, there's the gesture to you and your organization, Community Boats Pilot Program, Recapitalization Icebreaker Fleet, which we talked about, and things like the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which Andrea has written on. You want me to sum it up in 2 words? Right, it's a message of people first, and a lot of that focus is on for Northerners, by Northerners. The essential ingredient is it has to be supported by all Canadians for this to actually work and be enacted long term. So at the same time as we are relentlessly domestic often as Canadians, we need to adopt an international lens. And on Monday, the US Coast Guard released its Arctic Strategic Outlook. The statistics contextualize Alaska within a broader framework. I'd encourage us as Canadians to push our politicians. Yes, be domestic, fight fiercely for the interests of Canada's Arctic residents, our fellow citizens in the North. But at the same time, be careful about which Arctic region we're speaking about, what dimension we're speaking about. And as Adam reminded us, make sure our comparisons are proportionate to our population and our capability and our willingness to invest resources, because, like it or not, resources have to come from somewhere else. And it's those trade-offs that are really hard, whether it's within a defense context or something else. So internationally, we're not going to get to those wonderful spirits of connection, and I know 3CRPG, you have similar pictures of the gathering before you go into patrol, and a prayer is shared by every member of the patrol, usually in Inuktitut if I'm up in a community in Inuit Nanongat, right? And that spirit of connection and solidarity, we can't expect that internationally, but the images of Russians coming and landing with paratroops to take over alert on Ellesmere Island, I think are the wrong way of approaching the challenges that we're facing. And we had a wonderful, we were led off with Bob Ray, mentioning to us about how we often look at life through a rearview mirror. And my worry is that we have that comfortable Cold War analogy that we can refer to far too easy as soon as you resurrect a player like Russia. That we can slick back into, my mind, very conventional thinking of how we're approaching a future that I think today's discussion said is not going to look very much like the past that we previously encountered. So going back to that old Cold War toolkit to chart what our security futures would look like, in my mind, would be highly problematic. Thanks, everybody.
I can take a picture, I can keep my hands in my pocket. So I'd like to start off by saying I'm really glad you were the final speaker, because if you'd been the opening speaker, there's no point in really showing up. I don't think that can be taught. So this may be an unfair question to you, because I understand that in the slide you were referencing somebody else's quote, but I'm going to ask this to you anyway. So we're talking about the collaboration, scientific collaboration between Canada and Russia. So, and I'm going to try to keep this in the unclassified realm, which will be difficult, but where you have scientific research that possibly has dual purposes, and where you have some nations who have more of an authoritarian regime that can direct such research be shared with government institutions, possibly of an intelligence nature, possibly not. How do you weigh off the checks and balances, of the benefits of collaboration with other nations, and while I won't say sovereignty, certainly protecting Canadian national interests? How would you suggest we go about balancing those two approaches?
Well, wonderfully, I'm going to turn it right back around. I said, I think you gave us a signal or a signpost of where we might head. It's better collaboration between different intelligence gathering agencies, right? Better fusion of the processing and making sense of it. But I think you've captured it. It's going to have to be residing with experts, not me, but experts like yourself, who are actually seeing these different streams of class and unclass information that can be fused together into some sort of picture, and that requires certain surveillance capabilities and things that, as you say, maybe have not fall below the usual level that we're collecting that sort of data or that sort of information. I think that's the right question to be asking. And again, when I'm looking at the threat environment, Horizon 1, Horizon 2, these are, is the intent there, right? Threat equals intent plus capability. The capabilities are there if you're doing the scientific research, you perhaps do it. Is the intent there? In certain cases, I think yes, it certainly would be. And especially certain, same thing, we don't need to get into specific case studies, but there have been certain stories that have come out about what seem to be quite benign activities that would very much, on the surface, be very perfectly aligned with Canadian interests, where you start to realize there are other ways that these could be manipulated for some sort of advantage. I think it requires prudence. I think it requires a certain amount of discipline as a country to not feel like it's this cooperation or conflict binary where you go all in one direction or all in the other, right? It can be mostly cooperative, we might conclude, but we certainly need to be vigilant to make sure that people aren't exploiting that. And I think with some of the ways that Canada's positioned itself, when we talk about scientific research, different forms, setting up the Canadian High Arctic Research Station, Polar Knowledge Canada, saying, rather than having a Svalbard analogy that the Norwegians do, where everybody can come up and set up their own scientific station, we'll build the infrastructure. And we'll invite you here, and you'll be subject to our ethics approval process, including those conducted by Northerners. You'll be subjected to our security screening, and all the things we'll do as due diligence for foreign researchers. And hopefully that allows us to be able to get a little bit of a portrait that we can then assemble. And again, I want to come back to, and then let the experts deal with things and make those determinations so I can sleep at night, not having to worry about it. We're fortunate in this country that there are people who do that regularly and protect us from threats that never manifest because they cut them off before they do. I think making sure within an Arctic, that's a proportionate risk that needs to be managed. But thank you for the question, because I think the question itself identifies what I think is one of those areas that is a security issue area, and then trying to figure out what parts of the Arctic dimension to that may not be protected by existing national protocols or processes.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.